Speaking of the domestic front or the home front in the case of the war effort, it's worth bearing in mind that there were actually considerable divisions. Well, in some ways, that while the war to a certain extent healed some of the old divisions in French society, it also tended to create some new divisions as well. Some of the obvious examples of that are certainly between frontline soldiers and those who left behind. The term "palu," referring to the frontline soldiers who served in the French army, and those who became known as the embusqués or the shirkers, those who stayed behind and didn't participate. So that was one case in which, not surprisingly, resentment emerged amongst the frontline soldiers towards those they considered to be shirkers who were not doing their duty in remaining behind in France. Or sorry, we're not remaining behind in France, but remaining on the home front. There was also kind of new divisions between workers. Many highly skilled workers whose skills were needed for the factories found that not only did they not have to fight at the front, that they were paid better, that they had considerable leverage in their negotiations with the government for better pay, while on the other hand, white-collar workers, clerks, teachers whose skills were not considered quite as indispensable were sent off to fight in the war. And of course, that created a certain amount of resentment as well. But even for workers, it wasn't necessarily all, even for those industrial workers who stayed behind, it wasn't necessarily that things were perfect for them either. In fact, in some regards, with the growing push for industrialization, some workers simply lost their jobs to mechanicization. That as the French factories, in certain regards, found machines to be more effective to do at least simple jobs, some of these workers found their skills to be displaced. The big crisis for France as the war wore on was inflation. I mentioned earlier on that the French government, in order to pay for the war, had begun printing money. And initially, the efforts of the French to borrow money had kind of offset this and had not created a crisis. But by 1917, workers were becoming very, very conscious that their wages were not keeping up with the price of goods in France simply because the money was plentiful and its value began to decrease. The war also had significant impact for women, not surprisingly. I mentioned earlier on that many women had to be employed in working in factories to help build the munitions, although it would be a mistake to exaggerate the extent to which women worked in the factories in France. Really, only about 15% of the factory employees in France during the war were women directly. But women were able to fill up other opportunities besides working in factories, so more kind of less skilled jobs, postmen, bus conductors, teachers. Teachers, women had taught before, but rising to a seniority within schools. So for the first time, France began to see female principals emerge as well. So the war wasn't certainly an opportunity for women to gain newfound economic freedom. There were also rumors, at least it was popularly believed amongst men in France, that these women also experienced a kind of sexual liberation. Certainly there was a breakdown in kind of traditional attitudes towards what women wore. So things like the corset were kind of cast aside as luxuries and unnecessaries during the war. In other words, women could feel free to dress a little more freely. Certainly the old idea of a domestic sphere in which respectable women did not go out in public by themselves, that began to crumble. And there were some assumptions that women also became more sexually liberated during this time period as well, or at least that was often the fear that their husbands and boyfriends had who were fighting on the front. Another group who found their attitude and their relationship with France begin to change during the war were members of, colonized members of French society, or more specifically, people living in the French colonies who were not traditionally considered French because of their ethnic or racial background. I mentioned earlier on that hundreds of thousands of African and Asian workers and soldiers served in France during the war. Some of them were kind of encouraged to think that after the war, the position of their own countries improved, that they would be treated as equals within the French Empire and be granted certain rights, possibly even independence. That was often hinted at. Others, however, came to France and were exposed to more radical ideas, such as republicanism or communism, obviously in the wake of the Russian Revolution, and began to think that their nations would be better served by making a very radical break and separation from the French Empire. The man pictured here was one such immigrant who kind of imbibed these radical ideas. I'm not sure if you recognize him, but let's go to our first Jeopardy question of the day. Rebranding. Saigon was named after this man in 1976. Who am I talking about? Again, there's Ho Chi Minh. So that picture previously was of a young Ho Chi Minh living in Paris during the war. So for immigrants like women, for workers, the war created a change in their own circumstances and in some ways their attitudes to society as well. Meanwhile, the domestic situation, France had undergone a number of changes in government, as was the norm during the Third Republic. But by 1917, the French president, Raymond Poincaré, had decided it was time to recall a legend of French politics, a politician who was not particularly loved on either the left or the right, but who some felt might be the best able to cope with the tragedy and the chaos being brought about by war. So someone, Poincaré, summoned this man. I'm not sure if you're going to get who I'm going for by showing this image. But if you do remember his nickname, you'll know I'm talking about Georges Clemenceau, who had served as Prime Minister for a few years in the first decade of the 20th century. At the age of 75, Clemenceau was recalled by Poincaré in 1917 to become France's Prime Minister once more and to try and, I guess, break through the political logjam in France and hopefully steer the country towards victory in the war. Clemenceau very openly boasted that his policy was only war, nothing but war, that he wanted to pursue the war vigorously. He felt that the government had not been effective in doing everything it could to put France on a war footing to achieve victory, and Clemenceau very much saw his role as taking that step forward. He silenced dissent amongst those who criticized the war efforts, somewhat ironically given his own early pre-war criticisms of or is not pre-war, is during the war, his criticisms of the French government's efforts in 1914 and 1915. Hélène Briand was an activist I mentioned earlier on, a French feminist who was also a pacifist. Clemenceau had her silenced, essentially, threatening her with prison if she didn't cooperate and be silent. Another person who he took even more drastic measures with was, let me just get back up here, was Joseph Caillou, who I mentioned was a pre-war French Prime Minister who more than anyone had gone out of his way to reach out to the Germans to see if he could find a path for peace. And in early 1918, Caillou was thrown into prison. Essentially, the French state deemed that his actions in approaching the German government had so compromised France that he'd been so willing to make some kind of deal with the Germans that essentially what he was offering had amounted to treason treason to France. But the point being is that Clemenceau was getting tough with those who were in any way offering dissent to his effort to pursue the war. Another important change in the war dynamic in 1917 was created by what was happening in Russia. We mentioned earlier on the February Revolution. Here's the Jeopardy question I have for you guys. He became leader of the Russian government in July 1917, but was out of a job by October. Who was it? Well, if you were paying attention a few minutes ago in the previous clip, you'll know when I mentioned the guy was Alexander Kerensky. Kerensky was out of a job because of the second stage of the Russian Revolution, the October Revolution of October 1917 in Russia, the Bolshevik takeover. This is significant because unlike Kerensky's Democratic Republican Russian government, the Bolsheviks were determined at all costs to take Russia out of the war. And so by the terms of the Treaty of Brest-Litovsk, signed in early 1918, the Russian government under Lenin abandoned the war effort, and you can see on the map here the Germans were given substantial gains, as were the Austrians, at the expense of the Russians who were just desperate to get out of the war. This changed the Germans' thinking about how the war should be prosecuted going forward. They basically believed that as the longer the war went on, the more America's influence would grow on the war. Now that Russia had been knocked out, the German commander, a guy called Erich Ludendorff, the quartermaster of the German army, or the quartermaster general, believed that there was a window of opportunity open where the French, or the Germans, excuse me, still retained a military advantage. So this is a graph of the German military's understanding of the future strength of both the German and Allied armies. So you can see in the spring of 1918, the Germans believed they would still have numerical superiority, but that over time this numerical superiority would begin to fade out, as is being borne out by this chart here. So if the Germans wanted to win the war, they had to act quickly before the American military was a full and active participant in the conflict. And so in the spring of 1918, the Germans under Ludendorff launched a new offensive. But Ludendorff actually did something very innovative. Obviously, offensives were not new in the war. We've seen Nivelle, for example, Joffre continually launching offensives that went nowhere. But Ludendorff adopted a new tactic. What he basically decided was that the Germans would concentrate their forces to try and force a breakthrough. They would pour resources into that. But the key difference was that once these offensive maneuvers were bogged down, once essentially the Allies regrouped and began to stop the offensive, rather than carrying on, as people had done in the past, the Germans would simply pull back and shift somewhere else along the line and carry out a new attack again. So by pressing the Allied line in different positions, by remaining mobile, by cutting their losses once their offensive stalled and going somewhere else to launch a new offensive, they were able to push back the entire Allied front. And by the spring of 1918, a German war victory seemed possible once more. The Germans, as in 1914, had gotten to within 30 miles of Paris. In response, the Allies decided that they needed to have a coordinated strategy to deal with the Germans. So they appointed Ferdinand Foch, the commander of all the Allied forces. That is, he took command of the American, British, and French troops in France to coordinate their efforts to defeat the Germans. And eventually what happened was, essentially by the summer of 1918, the German offensive had stalled. That their inability, they lost a decisive battle in July 1918, which stalled their offensive momentum. And from that point onwards, the Allies were able to use their military superiority in terms of numbers, their kind of greater organization under Foch's command, to drive the Germans back. And so what you're looking at here essentially is in August 1918, you have the French, the front line. You can see it's being pushed back into Belgium, out of France. By November 1918, the German army essentially was in retreat after its failure to follow up on its victories in July 1918. By September, Ludendorff essentially advised the German government, you guys need to make a deal because our military is not going to be able to keep fighting. And the result was, in November 1918, the German government agreed to an armistice, to peace. And armistice was declared in November 11, 1918, to joyous celebrations in France, which so often during the war had seemed on the cusp of collapse, when defeat at different stages in the war had seemed like almost an inevitability, had not only survived the war, had defeated the Germans, had avenged the humiliation of 1870, and now looked forward, in terms of concluding the peace, to extracting financial revenge upon the Germans as well. And so in our next class, we will look at what happens in France after the war, and the attitude of the French going into the Treaty of Versailles with their allies, and in terms of dictating peace towards the Germans.